Okay, hi everyone. This is the Introduction to Course Design lecture for our class. Just want to take a few minutes to introduce you to these concepts. I know you're already reading about them in your text. We're going to first talk about coverage-based design, then we'll talk about what the differences are between that one and Wiggin and Mattei's backward design. And then finally, we'll talk about both Bloom and Fink, particularly as they help us think better about what our learning goals or outcomes are for the course. And Fink is, also talking about an integrated approach to course design. So we'll begin by talking about coverage-based design, and the truth of the matter is that most faculty use this approach. This is the traditional approach used by faculty when they begin teaching because it's an overwhelming task at first, and it's just a very simple way of addressing your class and what you're going to do in it. The way you begin is you would think about what content do I need to cover. For many faculty, that might be what chapters or what the textbook says that's going to be. For other faculty, they might think a little bit more broadly about the content. Either way, it's a content-driven approach. So basically what that means is you first think about what it is that I have to cover, and then after I decide what content I have to cover, then I'll think about what my learning goals are. Now, those learning goals often are much more content driven. What I mean by that is that many of them, if not all of them, may be tied directly to content versus skill-based learning outcomes. So some of you might have other skills that you might want your students to know about, but if you're really viewing the course through the lens of content, that may or may not make it to being one of your outcomes. The other area that faculty tend to focus quite a bit on is what am I going to do in the classroom to make that happen. So once you decide what your content is that you need to cover, then you're really focused and zoomed in on what kind of teaching methods or activities you're going to use in the classroom. Because it's content driven, the most dominant or prevalent type of method is probably going to be the lecture, because a lecture allows you to cover a lot of content in a short amount of time. You certainly might have other activities like group work, or maybe you have a really fun activity, a learning exercise or something that you want to do. Perhaps you have a simulation of a concept that you teach about in your class, and you want to make sure you have room for that. So what happens when we use this coverage-based approach is we spend a lot of our time thinking about what content we need to cover and how are we going to cover that. So the final and the last step of this process is to think about how will we know whether or not that's been achieved, our learning outcomes, and that's when we'll think about what kind of exams or assignments or other products we're going to want our students to provide. One of the things you probably noticed about this approach is it's very much focused on the teaching process. So what you do as a teacher is kind of central to that process. So you're looking at the content and you're really thinking about what am I going to do to make that content come alive and help students learn that content. And while that can be, certainly one approach that might work, there are other approaches that are much more significant and appropriate to the higher ed environment. So then we take a minute to look at the backwards design model. Wiggins and Mattei really had a very different approach of looking at it. So what Wiggins and Mattei wanted to do is they wanted us to take a look first at what is the end product. So at the end of spending X number of weeks together, most cases 15 weeks or so, what is it that we are going to expect students to be able to think, know, or do? So it's very focused on that product. So those kinds of desired results, whatever it is that we're hoping to accomplish, then become center stage for everything else. They become the driving force in every other activity that we do for course design. So once we have those established, and they may include content type of outcomes like we talked about in the other approach, but it also could be much broader than that. Maybe there's some other skills that you want your students to walk away with. Maybe there's some critical thinking skills, or maybe some teamwork cooperative learning type skills. So whatever that might be. Now what Wiggins and Mattei suggest we do is we jump directly to evidence. So we're still not moving into teaching strategies. We're keeping our mission and our kind of directed focus really on what it is we're trying to accomplish. And now we shift it to determine how will we know if we actually accomplish those learning outcomes. So we're going to look for what kinds of evidence will support that. And of course, we're going to need support for the end product. But as they mentioned, it's not just about the end product. We want evidence along the way to know whether or not students are on the path to achieving our goals that we've set forth for them. So there's a huge focus really on the learning outcomes and evidence for those outcomes. Once you have that kind of aligned and determined, then at that point, then you're looking at teaching methods. So you are going to look at methods, but you can't just take kind of a fun, cool activity and tuck it in, because everything needs to be aligned according to backwards design. So instead, you're really going to be asking yourself some tough questions. How can I best achieve this? Is a lecture the best method? Do I need to create some kind of case study or group work activity? Is that going to really help them build those skills? What kinds of assignments, both in, learning activities both in and outside the classroom? What's going to help them get there? And that's really where you start to think about what your role is in the learning process, but not just your role, what their role is as well. So the idea here is that you use the goals as kind of the driving force behind every action that you take in the classroom. And you can see that, and you can really kind of figure out pretty quickly that the backwards design model is much more focused on the learning versus the teaching. Teaching is a method in order for students to learn, and we do need to teach. We're the experts, and we'll talk more about that throughout the class. But when you're designing a course, it's much more important to focus on the learning part and what the students are going to be able to walk away knowing, thinking, or doing at the end of your term. Now, we're going to take a look now at Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives, and then we'll also look at Fink's approach. Basically, these two approaches are helping us better understand that first part of the backwards design process, which is what are your learning goals? So Bloom he's probably one of the most central figures really in this area. Really does incredible work. And as you know, his original, well, as you may not know, I'm not sure, but he originally had this pyramid kind of developed, and then it was revised by Anderson and Crotwell in 2001, I believe, and they shifted it from nouns to verbs. And they also played around with the language a little bit at the top. They put creating on the top, and they made a couple of other changes. But they wanted to really illustrate that learning is an active process, and that's why the verbs really became a part of the taxonomy. But the key hallmark issue really here is Bloom has a hierarchical model. So basically, he says you start at the bottom, and you need to remember before you can understand. You need to understand before you can apply, and so on and so forth. So most of us are, certainly content-focused activities may be more heavy on the low end of Bloom. I mean, they certainly could be higher end, but I think you'll see the coverage-based or content-based approach kind of getting stuck sometimes in that lower half of the pyramid. Now, we all do need to have learning objectives that are probably on the lower end, especially if we're teaching students who are new to our discipline. If you're teaching graduate students who have already been through an enormous amount of coursework in that area, you probably may not need that. You're going to probably be working more on the upper end of the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. But for many of us, it may be that we're sprinkled across all these different areas. We're building that foundational knowledge, helping students just memorize and remember content. I know a lot of times memorizing and remembering kind of gets a bad rap in higher education. People say we shouldn't just ask students to memorize information. Well, I would agree that we shouldn't just ask students to memorize information, but it's very hard to apply information if you don't really know it. So you need to be able to remember some of those basic concepts from your area. So remembering is a good first step, but we should not obviously end at that level. We need to go up a couple notches as well. The understanding one has to do much more with, do you comprehend that information? And we'll be diving into some more in-depth conversations about what does it really mean to understand? What does it mean to have a significant learning experience? And I think that Bloom and Fink come in very handy because they help us take a much more in-depth look at what do we mean by knowing and understanding and learning. Those are concepts that we talk about all the time, but I think we all often have different definitions of them. And we need to kind of really think more explicitly about what it is that we're saying. So when you move up this Bloom's taxonomy, you're getting much more into higher level cognitive tasks. And, you certainly are going to want to ask your students to engage in applying and analyzing and evaluating information and ultimately creating an academic product. So that is Bloom's taxonomy. Now let's go ahead and shift gears and we'll look at Fink's taxonomy. So Fink's taxonomy is a little different than Bloom. So Bloom really had that hierarchical approach, and Fink said, no, I don't think it's hierarchical. He took a more holistic, kind of view of how we want to think about learning goals. And you'll see here on the right-hand side of your screen, those three, foundational knowledge, application, and integration, those three categories are very much in line with Bloom language. We could take some and kind of even draw some direct parallels. For instance, foundational knowledge has remembering and understanding there. So if we can recall that information and comprehend that information, then we have that foundational knowledge base. Whereas application means that you can take that knowledge and put it into practice in some way and attach it to, give meaning to it through some kind of example or other application. The integration one is really helping us see the content isn't an isolated piece of information, but that it connects and relates to other either content, other situations, other people, other parts of our world. So the integration, Bloom, kind of talks a little bit about that application part, but doesn't really use this word integration in the same way. So this is one of the unique features of Fink's approach, where he really wants to make sure that we are taking our information and making those connections that are meaningful and making sense of that new content. Now on the left-hand side of this diagram, you'll see that there are three layers here that are not really directly related to Bloom's taxonomy at all, so they're different. These are more personal and focused on the affective parts of learning to some extent. So Fink says in order to have a significant learning experience, you want to not only learn that content, but be able to reflect on yourself and how well you learned that and how you could continue to improve learning, because obviously this is it's never a final step, right? You always can learn more about any subject matter or any topic or any skill. So part of the process is reflecting on your own learning so that you can continue to engage in further learning. He also talks, I'm going to jump down to that human dimension for a minute. He also talks about how learning this content is meaningful to you and to others. So what's the value of the content? So it's not just, again, that isolated information, but let's put some meaning, kind of behind that content. And how is that going to impact you as a person, and how might it impact others in some way? And then the last part of his taxonomy is the caring piece. What he's saying here is that in order for significant learning to happen, we need to kind of be emotionally engaged and connected to that material. So the more we care about it, the more likely it is that it's going to be a real significant learning experience for us. So you can see here, he wants the feeling component kind of a part here. He wants us to have increased interest. He wants us to really kind of just be passionate about it, because the more passionate you are, the more likely it is that you're going to really kind of hold on to that information and put it to use in some, valuable way. Okay, so those are the different taxonomies. That's just kind of a brief overview for you. Certainly you'll find a lot more depth in the chapters in your book, so I wish you all the best at looking at all of that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.